My brothers and sisters, the Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to John.
Glory to you, Lord.
Jesus said to Nicodemus, "Just as Moses lifted up the serpent in the desert, so must the Son of Man be lifted up, so that everyone who believes in him may have eternal life. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, so that everyone who believes in him might not perish, but have eternal life. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn it, but that the world might be saved through him. Whoever believes in him will not be condemned, but whoever does not believe has already been condemned, because he has not believed in the name of the only Son of God. And this is the verdict, that the light came into the world, but the people preferred darkness to light, because their works were evil. But everyone who does wicked things hates the light, and does not come toward the light, so that his works might not be exposed. But whoever lives the truth comes to the light, so that his works may be clearly seen as done in God." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ. Well, as we began Mass, I made comment about the color rose, the vestments, and reminding us that in the purple of Lent and the call of penance and works of service and charity, moments of fasting, we still rejoice in the dark color purple versus the lighter color rose. We see that juxtaposition. And in a couple short weeks, the last day of this month will be the Easter Vigil. And we have another juxtaposition as we begin that Mass of the Easter Vigil. If you've never come to the Vigil, come. I always love the Easter Vigil, not only because it's the best Mass of the entire year, and it's 3 hours long, which you know I love that. But there's always someone there who thinks it's the go to church early and get out quick for Easter Mass, and it's always fun talking to them afterwards. But the church begins in darkness, reminding us that the world is darkness, and we bless the fire outside, and we light the new Paschal candle. This one's getting very tired. It's burned down from so many funerals. And we bring that light of Christ into the church, which is completely dark. And we see that light. And we are reminded that we are to be the light as each of us take that candle to represent our own moment of baptism. And in a few short moments, the entire church is glowing in the light of Christ. We go from that darkness to the light. And we're reminded of that image today in the what I call end zone gospel, the most quoted gospel at stadiums and throughout the world. We're reminded of the difference between the darkness and the light. People prefer the darkness, and Christ, who is the light of God, comes to penetrate that darkness. We're given that juxtaposition between dark and light. And so far in Lent, we've been hearing about the light. We heard about the high points of the covenant with Noah. We've heard about the promise God made to Abraham. We heard about the law given to Moses on Mount Sinai. We've been hearing about the light. But today we hear about the darkness. First reading, we hear very clearly that the Jewish people were steeped in darkness, steeped in sin. God, desiring to bring the light, sent prophet after prophet after prophet to call them back, but those prophets were rejected. The light was rejected. The darkness grew even darker. to the point that they had completely abandoned God, and the time of their nation came to an end. They were in exile in Babylon. And even in the darkness of the Babylonian exile, eventually the Babylonian rule came to an end. Persia rose, and the pagan king of Persia, King Cyrus, it was through a pagan king that light came again to the Jewish people. And God called that pagan king to allow his chosen people to have their own land back and to build once again the temple that was destroyed. The light is always God's mercy. And in the most dark moment, we always see that light of the mercy of God. Lent calls us to see God's mercy. Do we see the darkness versus the light in our own world, in our own lives? And darkness is sometimes defined simply as accepting the sins into our life. We choose sin rather than grace in God, and that certainly is darkness. But there's other darkness too, the darkness that despite our best plans and hardest of work, we can sometimes fail. And in failure, we can question God. It's a darkness. Sometimes we see darkness in the events of the world. And our nation really, since the incident most recently in Florida, in the school, is focused in the deepest way on the darkness going on in our schools, becoming war zones. We can see the darkness in the culture in which we live, and that can even lead us to question, does God really exist? Is God's light present there? There was a great column in everybody's column this past week in the Buffalo News. I always look at that first to make sure nobody wrote anything about me in there, and sometimes I have found myself in there. But anyways, this gentleman wrote, and he said, last Sunday at Mass, our priest listed all of the school shootings that has happened in our country since Columbine. I don't know if you read that article. It's a beautiful article. And he said it was a lengthy list. And he said, maybe it's time to let God back into school. Maybe that's the problem. Huh? The darkness. Many of us remember when God was allowed to be in school, Catholic, public, or private. The darkness of world events questions us, does God exist? Hardship, genuine suffering can enter into our lives and can be a darkness. Tragedy that has nothing to do with anything we chose, just a tragedy that happens in our lives or family, or an illness that hits, some grave mistake that was made with tremendous consequence. A darkness can enter into our lives and calls us to reflect on God's mercy. Sometimes we simply rely on ourselves and our own answers, and we don't rely on God. It can be a darkness. This Lent, maybe think in the time that we have left in Lent, is there some area of darkness in your life? And how is it that we bring that darkness to the light, the mercy of Christ? I remember back a number of years. It was 2002. Right around now, my mother got ill. About 2 years she suffered. And I remember the illness and going to the hospital, spending the entire night in the emergency room, and we didn't know if she would make it through the night, as the doctor kept us well informed. And I remember, after having spent the whole night, going home for a couple hours to sleep and getting the call, you better get here, things aren't looking so good. And we got there and spent the day at the hospital. I remember driving on the Kensington Expressway back to the parish where I was living. I was in the chancery in those days at the vocation office. And I was talking to one of my friends on the phone to tell him what had happened. And I was very, very upset, we'll leave it at that, and crying on the phone. And he said, "Where are you?" And I said, "I'm on the Kensington." He said, "For the love of God, pull over and I will come and get you. You shouldn't be driving." And I remember for those 2 years, through the time of that illness, I was almost obsessed with the idea that I was going to make sure that my mother was going to be well. There's a problem with that sentence. What is the problem with that sentence? And we went through 2 very difficult years. And I remember for a couple weeks being home, literally nonstop, day and night, spending the nights there. And I remember my mother having a wonderful day, and I said, "You know what, I'm going to go home tonight." And I went home that night to sleep in my own bed. And I got up and I said, "It's time to get back to work. You know, we need priests." So I was vocation director. And I went to Cardinal O'Hara High School that day, and there waiting at the door was the assistant principal, one of our parishioners, waiting for me, knew I was coming. My father had called the school to look for me because my mother had passed. And I remember getting that information, getting in my car, driving, calling my friend on the phone to tell him. And he said, "I can't believe you. You seem so calm." And I said, "That's because I'm no longer in charge. God now is in charge." And I learned that I was living in that darkness of trying to control all of what was taking place and not really embracing what is a very natural part of all of our lives someday, the time leading to when we will breathe our last. I learned a great deal through that experience, and certainly helped me approach my father's own time of illness and death in a very different light. This Lent, maybe the darkness is something we fear deep inside, and that fear we need to bring out of darkness into the light of Christ. Maybe the darkness is some illness or something we need healing for. We have the healing mission, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, both at the noon Mass and 7 o'clock in the evening Mass, and talk, invite you to come. Bring whatever element of darkness you may have that needs to be healed, to bring that to the light. Maybe this Lent we need to simply totally rely on God, and as that wise member of the community of Western New York wrote, maybe it's time to let God back into school. Maybe it's time to let God back into every facet of our lives. Where is those moments of darkness, those areas of darkness? How are you bringing them to the light? And hopefully you come to the Easter Vigil, and as you light that candle in a completely darkened church, not only the candle will be burning brighter, but also your own mind, heart, and soul in the light of Christ.